The wind atop the wall had teeth. It bit and worried and made a meal of a man if he let it. Jon stood where the ice met night and breathed frost and smoke, because the air still carried the acrid tang of fires burning in the courtyards below. Stannis Baratheon's men tended their flames like shrines. The queen's men sang in a tongue that did not belong to this land, hands lifted toward the red river of dawn spilling thinly across the east. Beyond the black line of pine and stone and drifted snow, winter's emptiness waited, and somewhere in it, the dead. Ghost pressed his flank to Jon's leg, silent as snowfall. The direwolf's eyes were coals banked against the cold. The notches in the wall caught the first light, sharp-edged, blue-white, and the world below was a map. The huddle of Castle Black, the blank reach of the King's Road diving south, the ripples of drifts that hid what they hid. "You were not made for fences," Jon said softly, and did not know if he spoke to Ghost or himself. The wind answered with a knifing gust. The fires below guttered then flared, all at once, as if taking breath. A horn sounded in the yard, once and no more. A summons, not a warning. Jon drew his cloak tighter and made his way across the walk, down the switchback stairs carved into the ice, into the stone belly of the castle, where warmth was a loan rather than a gift. Men moved like shadows, cursing muffled in wool, steel clacking as it was buckled on, grumbles of men at any king's presence. Stannis had brought order to the ruins of their battered lives. He had also brought fire and iron. In the shield hall they had cleared the broken benches and set a long trestle for the king. Oaken boards warped by centuries leaned like old men. Rushes were scattered fresh and froze where they lay near the door. Stannis Baratheon sat beneath the black tattered banners of the Night's Watch as though they were his. He wore no crown. He had a hard face, all edges, a mouth made for judgments. Red light licked him from the brazier where carved faces went to ash. Melisandre stood at his shoulder like a flame in human guise, hair a darker red than the fire, eyes wine-dark and unreadable. Ser Davos Seaworth, plain and gray, spoke to a squire in a low voice and caught Jon's eye with a nod that carried warmth winter could not steal. "My lord," Jon said, stopping at a proper remove. "You sent for me." "I did." Stannis's voice cracked no ice and needed no yelling. "You know the wildling chiefs, what remains of them. You fought them and bled beside them. They listen when you speak. They listen when it suits," Jon said. "Like any men. Like any men," the king echoed. He put gloved hands flat on the table as if bracing against a deck rolling in a storm. "I have need of them." Melisandre did not blink, and yet Jon felt the weight of her gaze, hot as the brazier. "The Lord's work draws nearer, Lord Snow," she said. "The fires show it clearer each day. Your use in it was written before the snows fell." "Leave the writing to those who can read a ledger," Stannis said without looking at her. To Jon, he said, "I mean to take the North from thieves and butchers. Winterfell belongs not to flayers. The North remembers. It remembers better with spears in hand. The clans answer, slowly and not in the numbers I want. The mountain lords send me men. But I must hammer the nail in Winterfell with more than nails. The free folk have spears aplenty. I will not have them freezing on my doorstep while Bolton fattens on stolen meat. You will go to their camps and bring them to my banner." Jon heard the old words whisper like ice cracking. "Night gathers and now my watch begins," and heard Sam's low voice in his ear on that last night in the library. "Do not forget who you are," and heard a girl's laughter long gone over the frost. He folded his hands in his sleeves. "They will not kneel. Then they will stand," Stannis said. He spared no room for objection. "No kneeling is needed if they will fight for the king. They want land. They want warmth. They want their children to see the sun once in a while. Offer them what I will grant, a stark matter. In return, I want their oaths that when I go to war against the treachery in Winterfell, they come." "That is what you will grant," Jon said carefully. "What will you take?" "Loyalty." "Your grace," Davos said mildly. "They are not kneelers. They are not used to our bonds, our words. Best we say plainly what we mean and leave room for their pride." The same men who climbed your wall will not be made into small folk with a word. Stannis frowned as if the notion were a foreign tongue. Pride does not feed a man. No, Davos said, but starved pride is apt to bite. Melisandre's smile was small and secret. It is well. Pride stokes a hotter fire when turned toward a king. Take your fires elsewhere, Stannis said. He looked again to Jon. Go to them. Tell Tormund Giantsbane I will meet him at the king's pavilion in the yard at midday. Tell him bring as many of his as he can seat at a table, and tell him I do not host dogs. Harma's dead, Jon said. Came out flat. Her dogs as well. Then one problem solved, Stannis said. He stood. You will speak for me. You will bring them, and when they come, you will stand by while we strike terms. If we are to do this thing, we will do it clean. I am of the Night's Watch, Jon said. We do not take part in the quarrels of the realm. You are a man, Melisandre said, and her eyes were warm wine poured over a wound. Men choose. Your vows bind you to the realm, not apart from it. You do not have the luxury of offense, Jon Snow. Do it, Stannis said, or tell me now that you won't, and I'll find a man with less winter in his gut. The words found him before thought could catch them. I'll do it. If Stannis took his answer as surrender, he did not show it. He only nodded and turned to some other business, as if all men were bricks to be put into the wall of a design only he saw. Jon bowed and withdrew. Davos fell in beside him with an easy step, and together they walked through the keening corridors until the cold pushed even their breath into silence. You spoke without liking it, Davos said. I spoke because it's needed, Jon said. The dead beyond the wall don't care for who wears what crown. The living will. I would have them answer to a man who means to keep his word. The king keeps his word, Davos said. He expects the same. He expects men to be nails. Jon drew his cloak closer. The free folk are knives. You grip them wrong, you bleed. Davos's mouth twitched. Better knives than empty hands. Speak to Tormund plain. Speak to him true. He knows what the winter means. He's lost men to it. Don't dress it up for him. Tell him the king offers son for spear. I know how to talk to Tormund, Jon said. I am worried how to talk to the Watch. You told Stannis you would stand by while terms are struck. That was wise. Stand by. Make the bridge, don't try to be the road. If any ask you, you say the king makes his own peace. Jon looked sideways at the knight with the missing fingers. And if the bridge falls? Then you make another. Davos's voice was soft. Harder to burn a bridge that isn't all wood. They parted at the base of the stairs that led to the ice. Jon did not climb again. He crossed the yard, where the king's men had stabbed long poles into the drifts to mark a ring of clear ground, and the queen's men had planted their god in the shape of a brightly painted box. Red cloth clung to it like flesh. Ghost paced at Jon's side, pale shadow against snow. They were seen and recognized and not stopped. The free folk kept to the east side of the yard and the ruined outbuildings, where the wind found less of them. Men with long hair and longer beards slouched against walls and barrels and each other. Women braided, mended, cursed. Children were quiet. They had learned winter's lesson. Tormund sat on a broken sled with a hide thrown over it as if it were a throne. His belly strained his belt. His eyes were bright as frost. When he grinned, his teeth were the pegs of a dead man's fence. Beside him stood Val, hair pale as drifted snow, wrapped in furs that made a different sort of crown. She watched Jon as if she were watching the weather, dispassionate, interested, knowing it would decide the day. There's the crow, Tormund boomed. Some crows wear the black in their hearts. This one found a wolf there and turned the feathers gray. Tormund Giantsbane, Jon said. Stannis Baratheon would speak with you. Would he? And would he eat too, and would he piss? Tormund reached for a skin and drank deep. What does he want with me, I wonder? He wants what you want, Jon said. He wants your people warm and fed and living south of the snows. He wants their spears when he rides for Winterfell. He knows you will not kneel. He says stand, and stand with him. Val's eyes did not move. Stand. Under his banners. Under his protection. As free folk, not small folk. As allies bound for a year and a day. Give him that, and he will give you the abandoned holdings in the gift, wood and ground and walls to keep the wind out. Walls didn't keep Mance out, Tormund said. They did not, Jon said. But they will keep your children in. They will keep the snows from killing you at night. It's a bad year to sleep on the ground. Every year is a bad year to sleep on the ground, Tormund said. And so we sleep anyway. He hooked a thumb toward the boy who chewed leather at his feet. You speak pretty words, Crow. We are not blind. We can see the men in the bright cloth, the ones who burn the dead and call it prayer. We can smell what they burn that ain't dead. You tell me your king wants our spears, and I ask what he wants for his fire. He wants loyalty, Jon said. He wants you not to break the peace he gives you. He wants you to fight when he rides. And when he wants to throw a man on his fire for some red god's teeth to gnaw, he'll want us to sing, I suppose, Tormund said richly. He spat into the snow. I've no love for flayers in Winterfell. Those men would wear your skin for a cloak and not think twice. But I've no love for men who burn children either. Jon's throat tightened. The old wounds itched as if the cold had drawn them up through his skin. There will be no burnings, he said, and realized as he said it that he did not know if it was a true thing or a hope. Val's head tilted very slightly. You speak for your king now? I speak for myself, Jon said. I will stand by when you make your terms. The king is stubborn but not a fool. He needs you. A man who needs something can be brought to reason. Bring him the names of your elders, the men and women whose voices the rest follow. Sit with him at noon. Drink his ale and tear his bread and tell him what you require. Tormund laughed. Ale and bread. He'd as soon gnash snow as give us food from his own teeth. He's given more for less, Jon said. And you've risked more for less. You followed Mance to the wall because you thought all you had left was to run. You can't run any longer. Winter will catch you on every road. Fight for a place where you can dig your heels in. Tormund looked out into the yard where the wind pushed at flags like hands. He tugged at his beard as if checking it was still there. You always were a little king in your words, he said. Fine, I'll hear him. I'll bring those who matter. Not all, we're scattered and healing and counting how many live. But enough. Val stepped forward. If he insults us, we leave, she said to Jon as if giving terms to him and no other. If he names us lesser, we leave. If he asks for a child's life, we leave and take what we need to go. Jon held her gaze. He had learned not to look away first. I hear you, he said. At midday the sky was as white and indifferent as bone. The king's pavilion was a canvas thing, patched with sailcloth and banners, as out of place in the yard as a ship stranded in a field. Stannis sat at the head of the table, Davos at his right, Melisandre at his left. Queen's men and king's men and grim watchmen hovered behind. When Tormund entered, he made a point of shaking snow from his boots on the threshold. Val did not smile, and yet the corner of her mouth felt like a knife at Melisandre's throat. Giant's bane, Stannis said. You're taller in lies. This is me on a small day, Tormund said, taking a bench that creaked alarmingly. King, I've heard much about you. Some of it is ugly enough to make a man grow hair where he is bald. I am not a pretty man, Stannis said. We waste words. Tormund said. He slapped his palm on the table. We do. Here is mine. I have a people. They are tired and they are angry and they are not used to sleeping under someone else's sky. You give them ground where the snows don't kill them. You give them leave to take wives and husbands as they will, without your septons yammering. You give them leave to keep their gods and carve what faces they like. You give them wood for their fires, and you keep your bright boys from burning any of ours. You give them law, your law, but not the kind that puts a man's hand on a child because some lord wants a wife to sell. You do that, and I'll bring you every spear I can fetch. Stannis listened with the face of a man set on swallowing bitter greens. Davos's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table and then ceased, as if he had discipled them. Melisandre's eyes glowed but said nothing. Stannis steepled his hands. You will not raid. You will not steal. You will not take what isn't given. You will submit to my justice when you break my peace. A man steals a horse, he loses a hand, if that is the law where he steals it from. A man kills without cause, he dies. A man assaults a child, he dies slower. You will not lord yourselves over my small folk. You will pay the king's taxes on what you grow when you grow it. You come when I call. Tormund's grin was a winter-cracked road. All lords say the man who steals a horse loses his hand. The difference in the true north is the hand we take is the hand that steals it, even if it's got pretty rings on it. Keep your wisdom, Stannis said. You will be bound to me by oath. Your men will swear it in their fashion, if they don't kneel. You say the words and stand in front of their eyes while you say them, that will do. I have a claim to the Iron Throne. Whether men believe it north of the neck is less the point than that I intend to sit it. To do that, I must win the north, and the north must be whole. If I win, your people will be counted among the north's people. If I lose, you will have enemies enough without making me one. This is what it is. Tormund considered a long time. He ran his fingers through his beard until it stood in mad directions. A year and a day. Stannis blinked. What? We give you a year and a day. Then we talk again, Tormund said. We find if you kept your word and if we kept ours. If you kept yours, we keep ours. If you broke yours, we find another king. You have no other king, Melisandre murmured. The brazier hissed as a coal cracked and slid down into ash. There is only the night and the one who fights it. Tormund snorted. You're not wrong there, Red. He pointed his thicket of beard at Stannis. You've the look of a man who'd fight his own shadow if it got in the way of a door. Do we have peace? Stannis's jaw worked. A year and a day, he said. On the terms I gave. On the terms you gave. We'll set it to words. Val's gaze flickered to Jon and away. He did not know whether he had been weighed and found wanting or worth the risk. They drew up the oaths that evening. Davos's plain script and a watchman's careful hand turning speech to lines and lines to pledged breath. Tormund repeated the words in his rough rumble and named the names that would carry them. Other chiefs and elders and women who say kept men from doing foolish things. Men came with spears pitted and nicked, with knives built from rust and memory, and the bones of monsters no one had seen but everyone had hunted. They stood before a king who wore no crown and gave him pieces of themselves because the snow made men choose between bending and breaking. For each, Stannis spoke a few dry words and Melisandre watched like a cat. For each, Davos measured out ale and bread. Jon stood by, as he had promised, and said no more than necessary. He paid for it quickly. In the common hall that night, the air was warmer, and so the anger rose more easily. Bowen Marsh's eyes glittered above a beard stiff with rime. You had no right, he said. We are the Watch. We are, Jon said. He felt the weight of the hall on his shoulders. The men who had come north as a last resort. The men who had been sent. The men who had chosen with pride and learned shame. The men who had never been anything but watchmen. We are the Watch and we survive. The wildlings will not be our enemies in the yard any longer. They will not be starving with their backs to our door. If they were our enemies yesterday, they are not tomorrow. Until the day after, Othel Yarwick said darkly. The day after would come no matter what we chose, Jon said. Now at least we choose a direction to face. You've thrown your leg over a horse you've no right to ride, Marsh said. You brought a king into our hall. You put your face to his deal. It's not for the Watch to make bargains with kings. Jon stared for the space of a heartbeat into the surface of the ale he had not touched. I spoke to the free folk as I have spoken before. I brought them to a hall, and in that hall I kept my mouth shut when the king spoke. That was what I promised, and that was what I did. You peddle words, Marsh snapped. We see what you did. What I did will keep men alive, Jon said. If you'd rather they died for clean hands, say it out loud and let the wind blow the stink away. The static of benches scraping and deep mutters and the flick of flames' tongues were the only answer for a long moment. Then Dennis Mallister's thin voice, urbane as tea. We have done worse to survive, he said. I recall a winter where we were grateful for salt pork that remembered the pig only faintly. Yes, Cotter Pike grunted. And you ate it with a little fork, no doubt. He squinted at Jon. I don't love that I'm in a hall with a red witch's shadow on the wall. I don't love sending men to piss in the snow next to traitors who climbed this wall with steel in their hands and murder in their eyes. I love freezing less than both. The boys under me don't fall asleep so easy with the free folk this side of the gate. But they will learn. After a week, they will complain about something else. Men like to grumble. We'll set watch over our supplies and count everything 3 times. Past that, I'm with the Lord Steward in counting how many are still breathing at morning's bell. Bowen Marsh flushed. I am steward, You will not bandy my title as if you were selling lemons. No lemons grow this far north, Pike said, and showed his broken teeth. You want to hold to code, Bowen, you do it when your hands are warm. Your fingers break when you do it in frost. The hall did not laugh. It eased some. Men went back to their cups, to their quiet. Marsh's mouth worked once in distaste and he strode away, the hem of his cloak brushing dirty straw. They held the election 2 days later. Sam had a hand in it, steadying the scales, but the scales had been tipping for days before. Men knew the boy whose wolf kept watch at the edge of light. They knew the man who went out when it was darkest, the one who returned with men who would have preferred he didn't. They raised their tongues and their hands, some making note of every slight and favor as men do, and when the boards were stacked, the Count made a new Lord Commander. Jon's breath misted in the cold like any other man's as he accepted the cloak. He kept the oath he had offered himself. He remained a bridge. When Stannis called, he sent those who were not the watch. He listened to the free folk and counted their spears and the scars on their faces. He told them where to bed down in the old holdings of the gift, where the roofs sagged and the walls wept but were roofs and walls nonetheless. He put rangers on the storerooms and laughed when Tormund complained about the taste of oatcakes. He placed men he trusted between the Queen's men and Val, who moved like the memory of summer through the snows. He learned, swiftly, that there were not enough blankets for anger, and he made himself a taskmaster of blankets. Men who thought themselves born to swords learned to thatch in the dark and got good at it because otherwise they would die. A raven came from the east. Fires in the trees that never burned, lights moving where no men walked, long blue shadows under the full moon. Another raven followed it like a shadow of the first. Varamir's last beasts were gone to bones. The wild, the true wild, was itself crouching at the edge of the world, ready to leap. Jon sent men to close the gates twice nightly and not to look out too long when they did. He made copper kettles into drums of soup and hot slop and saved more lives with that than any sword might have. When Alice Karstark rode through the gate with frost caked in her lashes and her hair tangled with fear, Jon placed her by the fire and wrapped her in a blanket and listened with the gravity of stone. My uncle wants me to wed him, she said through chattering teeth. He would take my father's seat and name and my body both. You will not, Jon said. He spoke with a calm that did not belong to his blood, but to the office that now pressed on his shoulders like a cloak soaked with sleet. You will have the king's protection here. You will have mine. The girl's eyes found Val's across the room, found in her a shape they could stand near without falling, and the breath she let out was a fragile thing. It was not enough to keep her from fear, not enough to keep Stannis from using her as a sign. Stannis took Alice as proof that Carhold was not forced to treason but tempted by it. Jon watched him do it and said nothing, save to the girl later when he set his plan. He asked the young Magnar of then, Sigorn, to find a wife south of the wall. He asked Alice if she would marry a man of hard ground and harder hands to keep her alive and her line unbroken. She looked at Sigorn and saw in him not a comfortable life but the end of the life she feared more. She nodded. They married under a rough-hewn beam in a room where drafts went to war with smoke. Jon set his palm on their clasped hands and named the old words that he had no right to say and said anyway, because a girl's life mattered more than a rubric codified by some dead lord 1,000 years ago. Stannis did not smile at the wedding, but his men watched and took note. The Thens marched south with him the next morning. They were not many, But their spears were true and their steps did not falter when the snow tried to eat them. Behind them came Tormund, laughing and cursing, and behind him the free folk in a river that widened and narrowed according to the land. 1,002-3, numbers slippery as eels when counted north of the neck. Enough that the king's ranks looked suddenly like a layer cake, rough and uneven and not at all the neat bread he preferred. Enough that the men in flayed man colors sent to watch from the edge of the wood turned their horses away and went back quickly. The march south was a siege by another name. Against weather, against ground, against the small appetites that become enormous when denied. The queen's men murmured prayers to their red god and carried torches like they were shields. The free folk spat and rolled their eyes and called the torches wasteful. At night, the campfires were islands in a sea that made its own moons out of ice. Jon rode between them when he could, reminding one half they did not have to love the other so long as they didn't kill them. He had a word for every tent, if not a solution for every problem, and sometimes a word is more precious. At Deepwood Motte, iron rang like bells on a madman's church. The Ironborn had held there long enough that their stink had seeped into the timber. They laughed at the snow and called Stannis a starving crow. They did not laugh when, under the white noise of the storm, a party of free folk crawled on their bellies under the palisade, knives in teeth, fingers raw where they had scraped at frost-sunk logs. They opened the gate to a wave of north and south combined enough like a tide to be called one. Tormund led that first lunge and came away with a dent in his skull that made him swear off certain gods for a night. Sigorn took a cut to the cheek that Alice would later kiss and call handsome. In the confusion, the Ironborn commander, a hawk-nosed woman with iron in her eyes and some humor left in her blood, was dragged out of a knot of fighting men by Stannis's guard. She gave her name as Asha and her smile as a blade. "You'll want to hold me," she said to the king, who looked like a man deciding how many stones made a road. "I'd make a mess on your halls if you let me walk." "You'll be held," Stannis said, after a beat. "I do not waste good wood on gallows in winter. Mercy from a king." "I've seen rarer things," Asha said and let herself be led away. She glanced once at the free folk. "They don't look much like allies, but they bleed the right color." "They're men," Jon said, "so they bleed. And that's all that makes a man," she said under her breath, and no one but Jon heard. From Deepwood Motte, Stannis meant to strike for Winterfell by roads that were no longer roads but guesses. He left a garrison stout enough to discourage Ironborn fantasies and took the rest with him. Clansmen hungry for Bolton blood, thens with their new bonds, free folk who gagged on discipline but loved to fight. The banners made a forest that moved. A crowned stag, a flayed man, a broken wheel, a field of merman green as summer that had not been seen in these parts in too long. Men whispered the name Manderley with a mix of greed and respect. Jon would have liked to see Lord Wyman's eyes when he heard of the river of wildlings marching under a king's colors. He imagined there was laughter in it, low and deep, and knives. He could not go with them. He wore a black cloak now that had the weight of 10 winters. He kept the wall because that was what the wall asked for, and sometimes what it asks for is everything. He watched them go, a line of men across a white world, and felt the tug in his chest that meant a part of him was leaving with them and would not return under the same skin. He turned to the work that remained, which was all work. Men to feed, gates to keep, ravens to send, quarrels to pat down with a firm palm. Ghost hunted along the inner wall and returned each day with a muzzle red and eyes bright, and grew restless, as wolves do when the pack thins. Ravens brought news. Some of it was lies and some of it truth, and some of it the kind of truth that lies and lies that tell truths no man wants to hear. Jon learned to listen for shape instead of sound. He learned to hear what the winter was saying rather than what men said about one another. He heard that Roose Bolton meant to hold a grand show at Winterfell to make love to the look of a peace he had not earned. He heard that Ramsay Bolton wore kindness like a glove and threw it away as soon as the fingers warmed. He heard that Wyman Manderley fed his guests well, and wondered what the meat was. He heard that the Freys crossed the white knife with their horses stumbling and their banners drooping under frost, and he smiled without joy. A letter came on pink parchment tied with a strip of flayed skin. Jon held it in his hands and felt nothing at first, then the slow curl of anger like a brand being drawn from coals. The words named him bastard and told him Stannis was dead and the free folk broken and the queen with her god's men roasted. The words asked him to bring back his false wife and his dignity and set both at the foot of Ramsay Bolton's chair. The words promised to peel him like fruit. Jon read them alone and then aloud. He watched men's faces as he did. Some went white, some went red. Bowen Marsh went a clay color that did not become him. Melisandre's eyes glittered with heat. "The bastard lies," she said with the certainty of fire. "I saw the shadows on the snow. I saw the tide turn red. But I saw no king fall. Men fall and kings rise," Tormund said from the back of the hall where he had come to sit with his spear across his knees. "And sometimes the other way. You don't find the truth by who says it pretty. A trap," Davos would have said, were Davos here. He had gone south at Stannis' word to parley with a fat lord in a white city where the knives were hidden in pies. Jon said it for him. "It's meant to pull us down the King's Road like a fish on a line." Bowen Marsh's jaw quivered. "You must not go. We stand the wall. We do not sally for petty quarrels." "You call the slaughter of thousands and the breaking of oaths a petty quarrel," Jon said, and his voice did not rise. "I do not go. I will not break my vow for a flayer's bait. The watch will remain. The wall will not be left to the wind and whoever walks with it. We will not be fooled into leaving the door open for death to walk in." "Then what?" 100 voices asked in one. "Then we make it so Winterfell does not fall," Jon said. "We do it with ravens and with words and with the bare fact of numbers. We send Tormund with 100 of his best on snowshoes north of the Long Lake to harry any line of Freys who think to tie a bough around the king. We send the then's word at Carhold to strike at men in Bolton's pay who move along the bight. We send Lord Manderley the pink letter and trust him to read it right. We keep the wall." And to Bowen Marsh alone later, in the blind stare under the ice where every sound echoed, he said, "And we prepare. We sharpen obsidian. We cut it into knives and arrows until our hands are numb. We drag the sally gates each morning and ensure they still move. We burn the bodies of men who die before the cold can ask them who they serve now." Bowen's face pinched. "You sound like a boy playing at king." "I sound like a man who knows how thin the ice is," Jon said. He leaned in until he could see his own frost-rimed breath cloud near Marsh's beard. "Do not stand in my way when the dead come. I have no space for you in that moment." The first night the dead tested them, it was clear, starlit, the kind of night that should have been beautiful and was not. The trees beyond the ring of watchfires stood as a congregation holding its breath. The dogs whined. Ghost went stiff as a drawn bow. Men on the outer ramparts whispered and then went silent as shadows moved where there were no men to cast them. The cold deepened like a hand closing around the heart. The gate rattled not with force but with an intent like thought. Something that was not a voice spoke under the wind. Men on the wall told themselves later that it had been nothing but the night and fear. Jon was below, hand on Longclaw's hilt, and he heard it very clearly. "Come out." They did not open the gate. They did not let their fear grow legs. They made their fear into drills and orders barked until the barking felt like safety. When the first of the dead pressed against the stones, old bones wrapped in old furs, the eyes blue with a depth that drowned. The fire arrows took it in the chest and made it a candle that collapsed. It did not scream. Screams would have made it easier. They burned what they could, and what they could not, they pushed back with dragonglass on the points of spears that shook. The men who had sworn to Stannis fought beside men who had sworn to no one and beside men who had sworn to the wall and meant it with their marrow. On the ramparts, Queen's men held torches in both hands and wept quietly while their beards froze into spears. When the dead withdrew, it was not in panic but in policy, as if they had come to measure. The measure they took did not comfort Jon when he lay down for an hour's cold sleep before dawn. 2 days later word came from the crofters' village on the lake's far shore that men in trout-speckled cloaks had ridden past at speed and come back slower, bleeding. A day after that, a rider arrived with Wyman Manderley's seal on a scrap of stiff paper. The words were warm as the hearth he promised to light for King Stannis when he came to White Harbor. He named the phrase who would not be available for supper henceforth and did not explain why. He sent a baked pie as if the season allowed such luxuries. When Jon broke it open, the smell was spiced and sweet and covered the copper that lay under it. He stamped down the sickness and sent a raven with thanks and instruction. Manderley's men in the hills could cut a throat more quietly than any wildling and wood for the right feast. The winter ground swallowed men. Some it returned to their mothers. Some it kept. Stannis learned how to read the ice with a hunter's eye. He ruined a fry charge by letting them come and then cutting the surface with axes men had held ready like prayers. He took the measure of the Boltons in the way a man might assess a cursed blade, with contempt and with caution. Asha Greyjoy walked from his camp in bonds and walked back to it again after saying something sharp to a lord whose name she declined to remember. She laughed when Tormund told her she had iron in her belly. "It's cold," she said. "It needs something." It was not one battle but a dozen small knives sticking in the north all at once. Men froze in ones and tens and were found with the snow drifted up like a blanket. The Freys died angry, which made them die faster. The Boltons died quiet, which meant less. It was Val who first saw the other front turning toward them. She came to Jon at night with her fur hood rimed and frost on her lashes. "The forest burns without fire," she said. "I do not like the way the snow smells." He did not either. The smell was of copper and salt and old stone. When the tree line moved again that night, it was not wind but wills. There were more dead than before, and not all of them were men. Something vast moved between the trees, displacing air in a way that made lungs forget how to work. Jon found he was smiling very faintly, the way a man smiles when there is nothing left but what he came to do. "Hold the line," he said, and they did. They held the line with fire and obsidian, and when both ran low they held it with their bodies. Queen's men chanted in their southern prayers and watched them freeze in the air, as if even the gods could not keep up. The free folk fought like men who had been running all their lives and at last turned to push. The watch fought like a hinge on which a door must swing without breaking. Melisandre stood with her hair unbound and her eyes alight and called down heat from a sky that had no warmth left to give. Where she pointed, flame sprang, and where flame sprang, some small part of death retreated. When the dead reached into the fire recoiled, as if it had touched a master. Jon moved with long claw as if the sword had grown from his arm. The dragon steel cut where iron did not. When a tall pale thing stepped lightly over a burning log and raised an arm that trailed frost like a gown sleeve, Jon met it. The sound when their weapons touched was the pop of ice and a child's cry swallowed whole. The thing, King, White Lord, Other, all the names men had whispered and none of them mattered, tilted its head and considered Jon as if measuring a garment. He struck. He parried. He struck. When he struck true, it shattered with a silence that thundered. The pieces of it did not steam. They lay glittering like broken glass, and then the glitter went dull. After, when men stumbled away shaking and choking on air that felt like knives, when women counted children and found some of them wanting, when the fires burned low for want of fuel and not desire, Jon sat on the steps of the tower and let Ghost lay his head on his knee and tried to think of nothing. The sky bled from black to white. Val stood near and looked east with the face of the land itself, old and young and unforgiving. "You cannot hold it for long," she said. It was not unkind. "I will hold it until it's held," Jon said. His breath made a cloud that hid his mouth for a moment and then faded. "You will die for it," she said. "Maybe," Jon said. "There's not enough wood to burn that many of us. We'll have to be clever. We'll have to be stubborn. You'll have to be a king," she said. He turned his head. "Only if a king is a man who does what is there to be done when no one else will." "That is one kind of king," she said. "The only kind I would follow." He laughed without humor. "Then follow Stannis. He's the one with a crown waiting for him somewhere warmer than this." "Stannis fights his war," Val said. "You fight this one." Before the next attack could test them, a rider came through the snow as if spat out by it. He'd come from Stannis's camp with blue on his lips and blood frozen to his boot tops. His words came in clumps as if he were coughing up coins. "They burned the lake," he managed. "They broke the phrase on it. The Boltons are in the castle with their bastards. The king sends word he will starve them out. He sends word he will have the boy Theon Greyjoy and the girl who was named Arya and was not. He sends word he will have their stories told right." "Good," Jon said. He made the rider drink and got the frost cracked off his face with soft cloth and harsher curses. "Tell the king we will hold. Tell him we have the North's true enemy knocking and we will not open. Not for a pink letter, not for a fear. Tell him if he wins, he must win quick. The dead don't starve. They only wait." The rider nodded as if his head were a gate on bad hinges. He left, which felt like watching a spark blown back toward a fire it had no right to reach. The next blow fell not on the gate but from within. A knife, slim and steady. Men Jon had counted as sure as the wall itself turned their mouths into wounds and their eyes into accusations. Bowen Marsh came to him in the yard with 3 others who wore their resentment like armor and said things about vows and neutrality, and how a Lord Commander who bent the watch to a Southern King's war had already betrayed what he was set to guard. "Not a Southern King," Jon said. The snow made his hair a wild crown. "A Northern King for now, and I have not bent us to him. I bent the free folk to him. The watch stands, and I made the watch stand. You don't like the heat from the fires he brought because it throws light into all our corners. That's not treason. That's discomfort. You can dress it in silk," Bowen Marsh whispered, and his face was pale and wet and ugly with a grief Jon had not seen in him before. "You sold us to the first king with a pit in his belly." The knife was in Bowen's hand. Jon saw the blade as a thought rather than a thing. The world slowed, as it does when the air becomes water. Ghost lunged, the white of him a snarl made into flesh. Marsh flinched. The blade skipped like a stone and cut cloth and skin and found little else. A spear came down from the side into the side of the man to Marsh's left, and Tormund's roar filled the yard like a winter storm coming over the hills. Men tumbled and rolled in the snow, and the first drop of blood that struck it steamed. More men ran, for and against and away, and the yard became a tangle. It might have ended there in a pool of red turning black with cold, but Melisandre appeared as if from the fire itself and held up both hands. "Stop," she said, and her voice was not loud, carried anyway. Perhaps the wind was tired of carrying men's shouts. "Put down your knives," Jon said. His own hand was wet where the blade had kissed it. It hurt the way a broken promise hurts. Dull, deep, indisputably. "If you want to judge me, call a vote of the officers. If you want to replace me, do it with the law. If you strike me down in a yard like a pig, the wall falls. It doesn't fall today. It falls when the dead push against it next and find men too busy killing each other to hold the gate." Bowen Marsh's breath rattled. He dropped the knife. It made a small noise that still found everyone. He sank to his knees like a man who had dropped something heavier he could not name. His tears froze on his face. Men moved in, now to lift rather than to stab. Tormund put the butt of his spear on the ground and snarled less. Melisandre lowered her hands and smiled a smile no one liked at all. Jon's blood stained the snow in a thin line. He wrapped it as he would wrap any pike hand's cut and went back to the counting of blankets. There is nothing so clarifying as the knowledge that a handspan to the left and you would now be a story, he thought. He slept a little and woke when the wind changed and tasted iron and distance on it. Stannis took Winterfell, not by a single blow but as a woodsman takes a great tree with patience and attacks where the wood is weakest. He starved the bastards. He whispered to the hungry. He made men measure their own bellies against the weight of their grudges and find that the latter were heavier. Wyman Manderley brought carts that creaked with bad meat and good news. When the gates opened, they did not open for Ramsay Bolton's banners, but for Lord Manderley's smiling merman woven over cart canvas. The bastards ran. Some ran south, where justice with a long memory waited by warm rivers. Some ran north, where justice with no memory waited under the trees with blue eyes. In that winter of knives and numbers, something like a council convened in Winterfell's great hall. It smelled of pine boughs and smoke and old fear being washed off stone. The banners hung again, some of them crooked, some of them cleansed. Stannis sat on a chair that was not a throne and looked like a man who had wrestled a beast in the dark and taken its teeth as trophies. Wyman Manderly sat beside him like a harbor wearing armor. Mountain lords leaned together like boulders. Tormund stood near, fidgeting like a bear in a room he did not fit. Val occupied space the way Dawn does, without asking. Jon, when he entered, felt every eye as a decision yet to be made. Stannis gestured. "Lord Commander, you've held the wall." "For now," Jon said. "For as long as we can." "How long is that?" Wyman asked, as if he were asking about an account. "A man likes to know what debts come due. As long as there is wood and food and men with hands that can string bows and hold spears and light torches," Jon said. He did not gild the answer. "If the dead bring a true storm, none of that will be enough without help." "Help?" Stannis repeated. His face did not soften. "You have it. You have as much of it as I can give without breaking this hold, and perhaps more than I should. I will send men. I will send carts of dung if I must. Anything that burns." He glanced at Melisandre, who stood behind him like a red shadow. "We will set what fires the winter will let us. After I go south, I have wars of my own, but this is the war that matters. I'm not blind." "You sound like a king," Tormund said cheerfully. "I'll follow that." "You already do," Stannis said. Wyman cleared his throat. "The North remembers," he said. "It also learns. It has learned to eat pie it did not order and to smile while doing it. It can learn to sit in a hall with free folk who do not kneel if those free folk bleed where we bleed. It will be hard, but then it is the North." Val's lips curved. "Hard is something we have. The thens hold Carhold," Jon said. "Not without resistance, but with marriage and with walls. The stands. That means something. It means lines on maps are not so stiff as iron if you heat them. We'll heat them by breathing on them together," Wyman said. He looked at Jon with his heavy-lidded eyes. "And you, Lord Commander? Will you bend your knee to any king?" "If I were a painter, I'd want to capture this moment. Winter behind you and duty in your hand and a crown at your feet you will not stoop to pick up." "I have a vow," Jon said. "It is colder than any wind I've felt. It holds." "Vows?" Stannis said, and a shadow of sardonic humor touched his mouth. "One day vows will turn and bite you." "They do that already," Jon said. Stannis considered him as he had on the first day, measuring, not unkind. "If I die," he said in that voice like a hammer on old iron, "and if there is no throne left but a chair leg with a story, you will still have to hold the wall. The North will have to hold it with you." "The North will hold," Wyman said. "We've a winter for it, or 10. "Then let us name it," Stannis said. "We will write it in a ledger if we must, Lord Seaworth. The free folk will settle the gift. The watch will be the watch. The North will feed the wall as if feeding itself. In return, the wall will keep holding. If it falls, we all fall. Even those who believe only in their own bellies. Especially those," Jon said. "They made treaties ink froze to. They made promises that would be broken in small places and held in larger ones. They made something like a North that could stand." Jon went back to the wall with carts full of grain and wood and men who were not sworn to him and yet would fight for him because his fight had become theirs whether they liked it or not. He watched Stannis march south a little, then stop, then turn half an ear toward the sound behind him that no man liked to hear. He sent Davos to a cold island full of goats and rumors, and when Davos returned with a boy who remembered wolves and kind hands and a sister's laugh, the North shifted again. Rickon Stark stepped onto stone older than his line and made men cry with the sound of his name. The dead did not stop coming. Winter does not change its mind because a few stubborn men decide to live. They came when the moon was full and again when it was new and again when a day so gray it had no hour rolled over Castle Black. Each time the fire held. Each time the line bent and did not break. Each time fewer men fell because the living learn what to hit, where to aim, how to make their fear into stone. Melisandre's fires flared and guttered in patterns Jon could not read. She smiled sometimes when they held, and sometimes she looked afraid, and that made Jon afraid in his marrow. Tormund told jokes so filthy they scoured despair off men like sand on a pot. Val stood on the wall when the wind had teeth and scouted with eyes that seemed to see through snow. Ghost vanished and returned, white on white, a silent punctuation to the long sentence of their days. Jon slept in snatches. He dreamt of lean-faced kings who did not bend, of wolves running across snow stained with ash, of iron thrones and wooden chairs and a low stone wall that kept something bad out long enough for children to become old. He woke with a name in his mouth sometimes, his father's or a girl's, or a word that was not a name at all but a hope so small it embarrassed him. The winter tightened its grip. Men grew gaunt and found they still had fists. A raven from the south said a dragon had stirred in the east, this again and again. Ravens are great liars. Snow deceived less. It told the truth of a thing by whether it covered it or let it stand. Jon learned its language as if it were a book he had always meant to read and had never been taught. When the great attack came, it was not a single wave but the sea itself, come to see what stones had been set against it. The dead walked as if they had always meant to walk and had been politely waiting for an invitation. The others stepped like princes among them. The air stung with a cold that peeled skin off sin and truth alike. Against this, the living set everything. They set barrels of pitch and great knitted nets soaked in oil and slung from crenellations. They set lines of archers with arrows whose tips gleamed black with dragonglass and hands that shook but not enough to loose badly. They set spears with waiting men behind them and men behind those men, ready to step forward when the first line went down. They set queen's men with torches and mountain men with axes and free folk with whatever they trusted and watchmen with a faith in their wall that was all the religion they could stomach. Jon walked the line. He put his hand on shoulders and said names. To each man he gave the only prayer he had. Hold. When he reached Tormund, the big man grinned through ice and snot and blood. You have a way of making a day's work out of a year's task, he said. I'm too old for this. You're too stubborn to be old, Jon said. He did not let himself look beyond the yard, where the white pressed in like the inside of a lung. Melisandre stood with her arms stretched as if she might hug the world and wring it warm. The veins in her neck stood out like cords. Her mouth moved and the words came without sound and with all the force of scream. The sky above her rippled. The air warped. The first ranks of the dead hit flame not of this world and made it squeal. It held for a heartbeat. Then the cold ate it. They fought. They fought in a way that made a mockery of memory, because after, men could not compare it to any other fight without laughing or crying or both. Jon's arms turned to dead things that swung anyway. Longclaw grew heavy and then felt light as if it had decided it belonged to this. At some point he fell and Ghost stood over him with blood in his ruff and a sound in his throat that was the end of something and the beginning of something else. He rose. He cut. The smell of his own sweat was an old friend. A thin line of heat ran along his ribs and was ignored. They held. The gate did not break. The stones did not crack. The dead did not climb the wall. They fell back, not beaten but paused, denied. The silence after the last white fell was louder than screams. Men looked around and found themselves still there and did not know what to do with that. Some laughed, some ate, some cried. Jon sat down on the first step he found and watched his breath because it proved something that felt otherwise unprovable. That he was not a story yet. You keep doing that, Tormund said later, when there were fewer moans and more snores. You keep not dying. It's becoming a habit. I didn't know I was allowed to stop, Jon said. Don't, Tormund said, very serious. You're not allowed to stop. In the weeks that followed, men came north, not because they loved the cold, but because they loved their children's faces. Stannis kept his word as a man who measured himself by what his mouth had said. Carts came, sledges came. Men with beards from White Harbor and from the hills and from the crofts of the lands between came, and when they stood on the wall and looked out, they did not curse the old tales anymore. They cursed what they saw, and then they set their feet wider and learned where the dragonglass was kept. Jon stood at the heart of it, not a king, not a lord in any hall built by men with softer winters, but what the Watch had always meant him to be, a hinge. Behind him, the South, Before him, the dark. On either side of him, men whose hands had tried to cut him down and men whose hands would hold him up if he staggered. He watched the dead come and the living meet them and found that this was the work he had pledged himself to when he was a boy and thought that meant romance. There was no romance left. There was only the heartbeat and the breath and the steadiness of a hand that did not drop the torch. One night when the sky was a lid with holes punched in it and the air gentler than a blade for once, Val came to stand beside him on the wall. Ghost trotted away to chase a shadow and did not return soon. They stood without speaking a long time, as people who share a very large task sometimes do. "The king of your south will go," she said at last. "Kings do that. They follow their wars." "He'll leave men," Jon said. "He knows. He knows," she agreed. "You know more." "I know I will die here," Jon said without sorrow. It felt like a thing he had swallowed and learned to carry, like a stone that protects what lies under it from the wind. "I know that if I am lucky, it will matter." Val turned her head. The starlight made her eyes pools of ice. "I think you will outlive this wall," she said. "Not because the wall will fall, because you are not finished." He did not answer. It was the kind of prophecy a man rejects not because he fears it but because he hopes it. He did not have room for hope. He had room for blankets and arrows and the count of how many men could still climb the stairs when men began to fall down them dead from cold. He had room for letters to lords in the south and letters from boys who had become men and all of them asking how to light a fire that did not go out. He had room for a wolf's muzzle, warm and heavy on his knee. When the spring finally came, and it did come, as even the longest winters do not last forever, it did not announce itself with flowers or songs or tears. It came like a tiny warmth inside a glove, a patch of ground that stayed soft for an afternoon instead of freezing by noon, a day when the wind smelled of pine resin rather than stone. The dead came fewer times and with fewer princes among them. Men began to laugh more easily and slept for hours at a stretch instead of minutes. Witchfires burned less often and candles for reading burned more. Stannis went south. Not triumphant, not beaten, simply going, as stubborn men do who have not yet finished their task. Wyman Manderley threw a feast that even winter could not bully into silence and made toasts that men remembered for years. Tormund built a longhouse in a crook of the woods where he could hear the wind argue with itself and the children of his people scream at each other with joy. Val walked in and out of the gift as if it were the land's blood and taught women who had once feared free folk how to snare rabbits and mend old hides so well they felt new. Alice Karstark bore a son who had Sigorn's square hands and her father's eyes. The Thens learned the craft of laying stone in a way that did not fight the ground and were proud of it. Jon measured everything. He counted until the numbers were part of his hands, until drift patterns told him more than letters did. He spoke to men who had once tried to kill him and to men who would one day try again, and he kept his jaw soft while he did. He paid attention to the parts of his heart that hurt and made sure they did not harden into bone. He stood on the wall many nights and did not allow himself the comfort of believing it had been saved. He had saved it this week and perhaps the next. That was enough for men to live, which was all the saving anyone had ever truly managed. The morning a raven came from White Harbor bearing news of a ship with a dragon carved at its prow. He smiled and did not. He folded the scrap of vellum and tucked it away to answer later and went out to see whether the men on the morning watch had remembered to grease the winch housings. Ghost followed, tail flicking snow into air like quiet fireworks. The wind smelled of pine. On the ice, the dawn spilled again, thin and gold as ale filtered through old linen. The fires below were fewer, smaller, tended now more for meals than for prayers. The Queen's men had taken their chanting south with them. In the yard, a boy who had come to the wall because he was hungry and would now live because he had learned to be more than hungry laughed at something another boy said. It sounded good. It sounded like defiance and like rest. It sounded, for a moment, like spring. The raven's scratch was neat enough to belong to a southern clerk, and the wax on the fold bore a tooth mark where some impatient man had tested its seal with a fingernail. Jon warmed it over a lamp until the brittle fibers eased and read the words twice, once like a lord and once like a steward, because there was more than one story in any letter that came north. A ship at anchor under White Harbor's hill wore a carved dragon at her prow. Not a real one, not alive, but wood with teeth and tongue and eyes lacquered a black that drank the light. She flew no known banner. She had come out of the bight ahead of weather foul enough to drown an ox, and had made the river by following Wyman Manderley's beacon fires. Her master gave his name as Donnell Celtigar, and his talk smelled of salt and old loyalties. He had cargo. Casks of lamp oil, bundles of hemp, sacks of wool, and, in his hold, a gift from Dragonstone. Black glass packed in straw and grease, knives and arrow tips and the raw shards besides. He would sell and he would barter. He would kneel to no queen this far north and no king either, not with his keel still wet, but he would trade with men who paid with proper coin or favors he could take to sea. If the wall had need of obsidian, he could fetch more and cheaper, if a letter with the right seal rode south with him on the turning tide. There was a postscript in Wyman's handwriting, as round and heavy as the man himself. The Lord of White Harbor would vouch the crab's red hand for this single voyage. For others, it would be wiser to vouch with steel and ravens and every promise that could be made and kept. The sea was long. Men were longer when it came to grudges. John read the letter a third time and felt the slow, deliberate heat of a plan through the cold. Salador San had once bargained in the shadow of Dragonstone's black towers for a price. Even a Lysini Celsail knew the value of a thing that killed a nightmare. A Celtigar from Claw Isle was nearer yet to the old bones of Valeria's servants, and old bones remembered how to count. He did not sleep before dawn. He wrote 3 letters with fingers that cramped and ink that thickened in the bottle. One to Wyman Manderley with thanks and terms. A fixed price per wagon, salt cod and wool for a fifth, coin for the rest, grain in summer if summer came. One to Donnell Celtigar by name, with the black seal of the watch pressed hard into the wax to remind him that some oaths hold even when coin does not. One to Eastwatch for Cotter Pike. Empty the warehouses, clear the piers, make room for the 1,000 points of night that would cut through blue flame. Then he sent a boy for Tormund and another for Ed Tollett, because laughter and complaint were the 2 legs a hard thing walks on best. The day shook itself awake grayly. The yard was a scab of old snow and newer mud, and men went about their chores with shoulders hunched against a wind that had set its teeth in the wall and would not let go. Tormund came with a fur hat that had once been a shaggy bear and still looked it. Dolorous Ed came with his face and his humor, which were much the same. More black glass, Tormund said when John was done talking. He hefted one of the arrowheads from John's desk and peered through it at the light. It looks like ice that forgot how to be water. It remembers enough to cut, John said. We need a river of it. We need boats, Ed observed to the window, where no boats could be seen and only a white plain that might as well have been an ocean for all the help it gave. And men who think drowning is a pleasant way to die. We'll have boats, John said. Manderley will spare cogs. Eastwatch can put men on oars. We fetch what can be fetched from Dragonstone. And then we go fetch what cannot be fetched from Hardhome. Silence fell like breath fogging and then not quite. It shifted. You say that as if it were a place, Hardhome. I've always thought it more a suggestion. There be monsters here, with a crab doodled in the corner to frighten the children. It's a place, John said. Or it was. There are fires there that don't go out right and shadows that won't stay where you put them. There are people there still. Too many. They fled to the cliffs because someone told them there was a road through the sea. There is not, and they will die there in their thousands if we let them. Tormund grunted. Mother Mole and her dream. A king in the fire who opens a path for us across the water. She wasn't wrong about the king in the fire. He stands in the yard down there and curses like warm water. But Stannis won't open the sea. I know, John said. So we will. He wrote more letters after they left. One to Stannis, though he could have sent a boy to the hall and told him at his table, because some words wanted parchment. One to Melisandre, because she would come to him anyway if he did not call her. One to Samwell Tarly, though the raven would wander for months between Old Town's towers and the walls and might be eaten halfway by some hawk made bold by hunger. Sam would write back, and his hand would shake and blot the page with ink. and somewhere in it there would be a note about candles that burned blue as ice and men who called themselves archmasters and did not care. There would be also a correction to some bit of lore Jon had half learned in the library at Castle Black, and it would be comforting to hold proof that someone in the south still read books as if they mattered. When he raised his head again, the day had turned hard and bright, sky white and flat as hammered tin. Melisandre was standing in his door, as if she had been there for some time and he had not noticed. The heat that seemed always to ripple from her helped not at all. "You will go to the place they call Hard Home," she said without preface. "I will send men," Jon said. "I will go as far as Eastwatch. The sea is not my road." "The sea belongs to no man," she said, "nor to your others. They fear it. They use it. They do not love it. That matters." "What do you see?" Jon asked. He chose not to argue with that last. Men who loved or did not love the sea all drowned the same. Her eyes went just to the left of him, which was how she looked at flames that showed her something she disliked. "I see a shore that screams. I see children pressed together like coins in a poor man's hand. I see a sail that will not fill, and then tears. So many tears the salt of them could heal the world if tears ever healed anything. I see a white bear walking along a cliff and falling without a sound. I see you standing at the edge of the water and not going in, because if you go in you will not come out." He took that in the way he took the cold. "Let it come, then put it where it belonged. Then I will stand at the edge and pull until my arms fall off, and I will send others in." "You must not die yet," she said. It was oddly soft. "It would ruin your fires?" His mouth made it almost a jest. "It would ruin the world," she said. "And do not think I say it to flatter you. There are not so many men alive who can make the choice you made and keep making it each day after. A king of stone can do it. He is down there counting wood and wolves. He will do it because it is his nature. You will do it because you taught yourself to and because you cannot stop. The night fears men like that." "Good," Jon said. "Let it fear me from the shore." They built the Hardhome plan with gloves on because the maps were so cold in the tower room that they cut. Cotter Pike came 2 days later with frost in his beard like a white rash and his eyes alight, because inserting himself into a mad venture brought him the only joy any god had ever intended for him. They sat over the table and moved little ships like toys across the yellowed vellum. Dolorous Ed pointed at currents as if they were game pieces. Tormund tapped the cliffs and made a sound like a tree falling to show what would happen if men misstepped. Val came last, and when she looked at the map her mouth went thin, not with doubt but with calculation. "You want boats waiting here," she said, touching the small crescent of sheltered sand just under the drawn cliffs. "And here, hidden behind the breaker that is not there until the tide falls. You cannot wait at the mouth, or the dead will fill it with themselves. You want a fire there that does not smoke." "Green fire," Cotter Pike's eyes gleamed. "If your fat lord in White Harbor can find me any of Ares's madness, I'll pour it over the cliff and light my pipe with the rest." "No wildfire," Jon said sharply. "We don't have it, and I would not trust it if we did." "Then pitch," Val said. "No smoke." "Smoke brings eyes that do not blink, and archers on those 2 rises. Your men who do not miss, your men who will not run, and you must forbid singing. The cliffs listen." "Will your people trust us?" Jon asked. "Mother Mole has told them stories about fire kings and roads made of water. We will bring boats and not a road. They will have to trample each other to make the boats go." "They will trample each other anyway," Val said. She met his gaze and did not look away. "The dead will be trampling too. See that your boats come full and leave full, and set a man with a spear at the rope when you are full, with orders to cut it no matter who is screaming." He held her gaze until it hurt and then nodded. "There will be spears." The preparation made a sound like winter, with splitting, rope creaking, men cursing quietly as they carried loads that bent them like reeds. Manderley's cogs arrived at Eastwatch's frozen piers like fat ducks out of season. They groaned and banged in the chop, and men who had never been so far east stood and looked at the edge of the world and tried not to think the world ended there. Donel Celtigar came himself, his beard salted white with sea and pride. and he watched the unloading of his black glass as if each shard were a promise a long, long time had made and kept with him at last. He counted coin and took letters and drank with Cotter Pike until they were telling each other lies that were more useful than truths. Jon stood on Eastwatch's seaward wall and watched the horizon as if it might make a gesture. Ghost hated the sea, but he stood with Jon anyway and growled at the smell of it. The wind off the water cut different than the wind off the ice. It had fetched miles of stories with it and remembered some of them by mistake. They sailed with the tide under a sky so bright it hurt, 10 cogs and a scatter of smaller boats, Eastwatch's longships and fishing skeins pressed into duty and manderly men in hats that looked like jellied eels. Cotter Pike paced the deck like a captain born and swore like a wharf. Tormund had never liked boats and liked them less now. He sat under a tarpaulin chewing something that smelled like old leather and sang songs about bears that made Dolorous Ed say, "If the bears hear you, they'll drown us to make you stop." Hardhome appeared out of a trick of light and then would not go away. It was a long, low smear of cliff and a scooped bay like a hand that had forgotten how to hold. Smoke wreathed it, but wrong. It slithered rather than curled, as if the air pushed it back down and fed it to something. As they drew close, the noise reached them. A hum at first, then a buzz, and then the ache of voices layered on voices until no word could be pulled free. Men began to make the sign of their gods without thinking. Even Tormund's jaw went still. Once they saw the people, the noise had a face. They were everywhere the shore was flat enough to stand. They were on the rocks. They were at the cliff's foot, climbing and slipping and climbing again. They were too many for the boats and too many for the shore and too many for winter to feed. When the cogs swung in, the front ranks surged, and the back ranks tried to surge, and men and women and children went to their knees not because they meant to but because feet on feet will do that to the first feet down. "Archers," Jon said, though he was only there to say it twice if it needed saying. It did not. Cotton-fletched arrows hissed into the spaces where the dead would come if they came. They would come. He could feel the cold in the cold. The first boat grounded, then another. Eastwatch men leapt out and made a living chain. Cotter Pike's voice cut the air like a splitting maul. "No more than 20 in a boat. I don't care if you're drowning on your own feet. 20 and not one more. You there with the baby. Give her to the old man. The old man. He's got more of a chance of standing to thee or than you do." The crush at the shore's edge was like a beast trying to fit itself into a room. Tormund waded into it without a weapon and shoved men back with his hands and then his head and then his voice. "Back, you sodden sheep. You'll drown standing up. When I call your line, then you move. We're not wolves fighting over a gut pile. We're men." He made lines with his body where no lines could have been made. Val moved among women like a blade that cut panic instead of flesh. She took a child from a woman's numb arms and placed it in another's and slapped both cheeks and said words Jon could not hear. He could hear the effect. He saw hands go from clawing to gripping. The boats filled. They pushed off. They grounded again on other parts of the crescent to keep the dead guessing, if the dead guessed. They loaded over and over. The sun was a pale coin. Time became something that had fallen in the water and wanted to drown. There were two kinds of screams. A low, ongoing cloth rip that never stopped, and the sharp, high ones that meant some sudden thing had happened, a fall, a trample, a press. There were other noises under the voices, bangs and clacks, and a kind of chittering that did not belong to any living throat. By the third run, even the littlest children had stopped crying. They were too tired for it. They made hiccuping noises instead. On the fifth run, the shadows lengthened and the air went thin. Men looked up without wanting to. Something cold stood just beyond the fret of smoke and watched. Jon felt the hair rise on his arms and neck as if the cold itself were a hand. "Now," he said, and the archers loosed before he finished the word. Arrows in a sleet that made a black veil between the living and what was not. The veil held. The tall, pale shapes moved like men considering a door they could open whenever it pleased them but despised the look of. A white bear the size of a cottage came along the cliff as if walking a ridgepole, turned its head. It had no eyes, fell silently. It broke apart on the rocks below and did not bleed. Men screamed for it anyway because a thing that should have roared and did not makes the inside of a skull think wrong thoughts. They loaded more, faster now that the air itself made them. Someone began to sing, high and thin. Jon could not see who. The words were not words. The tune was not one he knew. The singing stopped when Cotter Pike knocked the singer flat with the flat of an oar. "No songs," he said, and for once no one argued with him about a thing he'd said that sounded mad. The first dead reached the water. They did not splash. They simply were in it and then were closer. The sea tried to turn them into sea things and could not. The front rank of small boats pulled so hard oars snapped, and men beat the broken staves into the water at what rose under it. A boy in a boat. No beard yet, no room in his shoulders for a proper deltoid. Held a rope in both hands and made a sound like a kettle. Val had tied the other end around her waist while she stood belly deep and passed children to arms she would never learn the names of. Jon waited until he was at her shoulder and took the rope from the boy's hands. His bones went to ice where the water touched them. They pulled together. The boat slid back and yawed and then straightened. The rope's fibers sang against skin. Somewhere behind them a pitch fire humphed as a torch found it, and the heat on Jon's face felt like a thing he had not earned. They loaded until there was no room to stand on the boats between the bodies, and still Val slapped a hand and turned a shoulder and shoved someone else aboard and cut the rope with a knife between her teeth. She pushed another boat off with both hands. The knife fell from her mouth. She had not the time to find it. She laughed, short and savage, at nothing at all. The pale shapes at the edge of the smoke moved as if at a signal only they heard. The water changed sound, deeper, older. Jon's teeth hurt. "Away!" he shouted, and it did not need to be shouted, for every man there had heard the old water speak. The last longboat shoved off with oars already digging, and men on the shore who had not yet moved did not move. They had chosen to be the rear guard simply by having bodies. Cotter Pike looked at Jon across open water and made a sign Jon did not know. 2 fingers to the heart and then flung outward. Then the longboats were veering for the cogs and the cogs already dragging anchor. The sea cracked, not with ice, with cold. It made a sound like a wall falling in a dream. Jon did not realize he had shut his eyes until he opened them and found he had lived in the intervening time. The pale shapes were closer. They slid along air that did not resist them, as if it would be bad manners to inconvenience such fine lords. The dead lifted their faces where the water laved them and did not cough. Val put her hands flat on Jon's back and shoved him. "Go," she said in his ear. "I will kick you if you don't." He went. He did not run. He walked into the water until it took him to the waist and then to the chest, and then he had to swim, and his armor did what armor does in water. He let it go, tried to cling to him like a lover, and sank instead. The boat he was aiming for grew no closer and then was there. Hands pulled him in, and one was Ed's and one was a hand Jon did not know, and one was a woman's whose knuckles had more scars than many men's faces. He rolled into the bottom of the boat and coughed and spat bile and water and looked back. Val had not followed him yet. She was still at the shallows, shoving a boy fully twice her weight because fear makes iron of men when it wishes and wet wool of them when it doesn't. She pushed. The boy fell into a boat, and her cracked. The pale figures reached the lip of the shore. Val turned then. A dead thing reached out a hand to touch her shoulder. She ducked it without looking, the way a woman will duck a branch she has passed 1,000 times. She ran into the water and dove. Jon's heart stopped. She rose behind a boat's stern, silver hair plastered to her head, eyes sharp and alive and aware of every inch of her skin. The boat's stern dipped under her weight and then rose, men swearing. She rolled in like a seal, spat, and said casually, "Pull." As if that had been the plan, they pulled. The cogs stood out with their sails fat-bellied and groaning. A wind rose where there had been none and shoved them toward Eastwatch's hard little harbor. Behind them, the shore went dark in a way that did not belong to night. Men did not look back. Some did and wished they had not. It was not victory. It was theft. They had stolen lives from a place that had meant to keep them. Some they failed to steal. That would be true if they had come with 10 times the ships. The counting afterward was a long, grinding thing. How many on each boat? How many children? How many husbands without wives or wives without husbands, and if the child in the carved cradle had made it or been dropped in the water in the press, and if anyone knew, who had seen Mother Mole, and if she had indeed gone into the water willingly when she realized the sea was not a road. She had walked until it took her, they said, as a woman might walk into a great field of barley to show it she had never been afraid of tall things. Bowen Marsh, whom Jon had sent to Eastwatch to count barrels because Bowen counted like a man building his own gallows and therefore counted true, took a spear through the thigh when the first of the dead clambered up a pier to fetch one last life for spite. He stayed standing. He held the pier rope with both hands while men hacked at blue fingers, and when they had cut the rope and shoved the boat out, he sat down quietly and fainted. They could not get him on a cart for hours because he kept waking and trying to stand at the next rope. Jon went to him when it was done and said a thank you that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a man who had not loved him choosing anyway. Bowen wept, in the clean way pain weeps, without shame. "I thought you were killing us," he said warily, as if he might yet hold to the argument. "I thought you were going to turn the watch into a ramp for some king to walk up on his way to a throne that doesn't know we exist. I thought you were going to kill me," Jon said, and his voice had no bite in it. "You still might, but not today. Today you held a rope." Bowen laughed, one bark, astonished at himself. "You're a bastard," he said, and his voice was almost fond. "And I am a fool. I will count barrels until the end of the world if you tell me to." "Count them until tomorrow," Jon said, and clapped his shoulder with a hand that still shook when it pleased. "Tomorrow we will find something else." The cogs took 3 days to unload because the harbor was a frozen throat that did not want to swallow. The black glass came off first because men's minds understood things that could kill blue eyes faster than they understood sacks of chestnuts. Donal Celtigar watched each crate and named each with a small pat and a number, as if he were making certain none wandered off for a drink. He drank with Cotter Pike again. Fewer lies this time and more laughter. When he sailed, he carried 3 letters with the wall's black seal, and a handful of fletched obsidian as a token any lord south of the neck would know if he had sense. Ravens went out. To Stannis, to Winterfell, to White Harbor, to Carhold, to Bear Island, to towers on lonely rocks that barely remembered what color summer was. Come with carts for children. Come with oats. Come with dung. Come with cloth. Come with the kind of men who don't run when the wind bites their ears. Come with ink and a hand that can write a name in a ledger and mean it. They came, not because they loved the watch, because they looked north and had learned to fear what was coming south. Men who refused orders from lords obeyed a word from Jon Snow because it sounded like a rope between their teeth in a storm. Women came with needles and fed men and scolded them like boys and then stood on the wall in borrowed helms and said they would shoot as straight as any man if it came to it. Wyman Manderley came himself, not all the way, but to the last field his great sledge could manage before the ground broke into rock and old bones. He stood in the snow and breathed like a bellows and laughed deep enough to make the air move. He handed Jon a letter with a personal seal and a flicker in his eyes that meant a joke no one else had heard yet. "When this is done," he said, looking not at Jon but at the wall as if it were a fish he admired, "we shall argue, Lord Commander, about kings and crowns and what is owed and what is not. For now I am in your debt. That is a large thing. There's room for a feast in it." "Save the feast," Jon said. "You will need pies for spring." "I have pies already," Wyman said, and smiled the smile that had made many a man wonder what he'd eaten last winter. Stannis arrived at Eastwatch Ironhard, with a beard that had more white in it than last month and clothes that had been mended by men who did not know how to sew but had learned. He walked among the children from Hardhome and did not kneel. He said a word to each, something he thought useful, and a few of them grasped the information in his tone if not the content. He stood with Jon at the harbor's edge while men loaded obsidian into wagons and the sea made that old, unkind sound. Melisandre watched from a little way off, her eyes heavy with lack of sleep. She did not look at the water. "You were right," Stannis said at last. Not to the sea but to the man who had told him a sane king would spend men and coin on a mad venture. "You were right because you were stubborn. There will be other times you are wrong because you are stubborn. I will not allow your rightness this once to purchase past you a license to insist on every lunacy." "Good," Jon said. "Then we will argue again. For now, I need men who can fell trees and a law in Winterfell that says the free folk who dwell in the gift will be tried under their chiefs for their own offenses unless they strike a man of the north. If they do, they answer to the north. If a Northman steals a free woman, he answers to me." "You would make 2 laws where one struggles," Stannis said, and his mouth flattened as if at a bad sum. "It invites cheats. It makes room for pride," Jon said. "Cheats will come either way. Pride is more useful." "You are thinking like a king," Stannis said, one corner of his mouth tilting as if in pain. "I am thinking like a man who does not want a knife in his ribs from behind the next time he bends for a rope," Jon said. "If pride eats my food, I will feed it when it keeps its spear point in the right direction." They named it in a hall at Winterfell that smelled of smoke and hide glue, in a voice that carried to Manderley's men and to mountain lords with arms like oaks and to women from the gift who had learned to stand with shoulders back. Stannis made a decree and had Davos write it and the Watch record it, because if 3 copies of it existed it might last, and if 3 different kinds of men cared for it, it might be read the same way in a year as it was today. For a year and a day they made it. Free folk to the gift under their elders, the Watch to judge between free folk and Northmen, the North to fetch timber and grain and dung and to keep the peace with the help of those same men they had called raiders. After a year and a day, the lords would argue again, because the North's habit of argument was as old as the snows. Tormund pledges the spears again in the Great Hall with his big hand on Val's shoulder and a grin that showed a new tooth scar. He promised to put a spear in any man who thought a child was prey and a knife in any man who thought burning a tree made his god warmer. Manderley stood up and pledged ovens. Alice Karstark came with Sigorn at her back, his hand on her chair, and pledged men to patrol the White Knife's banks and watch for blue eyes in reeds, because the dead did not only love trees. Lyanna Mormont was not yet old enough to sit at the men's table and old enough that she did anyway. She promised bears. The hall laughed and then stopped, because one does not laugh long at a Mormont who makes a promise. Stannis named Rickon Stark Lord of Winterfell under Stannis Baratheon, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, with Lord Wyman as regent until the boy's voice broke and his hand could sit heavy on a sword. He did not look at Jon when he did it. He had offered once to make a bastard's name into a key and had been refused, and he did not rub his own nose in old bruises. Jon thought he might be grateful for that later. At the time, he only felt a quiet, steady rightness press against him like a hearth. Winterfell had a Stark beneath its roofs. The wall had a man on it who remembered what that meant. He stayed for one night. He could not be made to stay a second. The road south had eaten too much of him already. He took men with him who could be spared and a promise from Manderley to feed the wall from White Harbor until the rivers ran free again, and from there until harvest. He took Davos with him again, because a king needs a smuggler when the law is ice and the paths are narrow, and took Asha Greyjoy in chains because he would try her somewhere with better light. The thaw that had flirted with the north began to make itself bolder. The streams lost their crusts. Men's cheeks lost their scabs of cold. The others did not disappear. The dead did not suddenly forget their employers. But the pace of their testing slowed, and when they came, men were ready. Obsidian points blackened and splintered and were replaced with others. Flint knappers who had grown up breaking rocks for fun in the hills found new work worth pride. Children collected splinters of black glass like treasure and were cuffed and then kissed when they gave them up to the Fletcher sacks. Melisandre slept, sometimes, for an hour at a time and awoke with her hair frozen to the pillow. She smiled more, which did not mean hope so much as a weapon gotten back after it had been stolen. Sam's letter came with a feather caught in the wax, as if the raven had rolled itself in some small, proud preening. He wrote of a city that pretended winter was a rumor, and of candles lit without fire, and of an archmaester whose chain had no link of dragonglass because dragonglass was not a metal but who argued anyway that it should. He wrote of a horn in an old book, and a horn that might break a wall that had never been broken and that perhaps no longer existed. He wrote that men in the south did not say Jon Snow the way men once had. They said Lord Commander and meant it. He wrote please keep breathing, as if it were a thing Jon might forget to do unless he was reminded. Jon laughed, reading that, and then he folded the letter and put it where he kept things that helped him stand when the wind pressed too hard. The first crates from Dragonstone had gone into arrows and spearheads and knives for the brave and the clumsy. The second went into a different project. Donnell Celtigar told a story in the warmth of Eastwatch's mess about old lords who put black glass into torches like a core and bound it with rope soaked in oil and then lit it. The flame burned whiter and harder, he said, and did not gutter in wind. Men who had seen many torches scoffed and then tried it and stopped scoffing. The light ate distance differently, sang. The night seemed to flinch. Dolorous Ed stood under one of the new torches with its heart of obsidian and said mildly, "I don't like that. If the night flinches, it means it can watch you the rest of the time. Better if it were blind." He held up a hand to the heat. "Still, my fingers like this. They think they're in Dorne. They'd peel like onions in Dorne," Tormund told him cheerfully. "There's a sun there. It's like a dragon that doesn't get bored. There were fights. Of course there were fights. Free folk boys put their hands where North girls did not want them and learned fast that a Manderley kitchen girl had a knife within reach the way she had flour. A Northman took a goat from a wildling pen and said he thought it was his. The headman of the village said he thought the goat disagreed and would they like to ask it. And when the Northman laughed, the headman's wife broke his nose with the butt of a spear because she had never liked men who spoke for goats. Jon sat in a chair that had been a wheelbarrow once and was now a seat, and listened to the headman and the nose-broken man and the goat's owner, and then told the nose-broken man he would help thatch the Free Folks' Hall for a month and also give back the goat. The man wanted to growl. He did not. He looked at Jon's sword and looked at the headman's wife's hands and nodded. The goat bleated disappointedly at not being consulted further. Sometimes the fights were worse. A man with a stag on his jerkin, one of Stannis's, held a torch up to a heart tree and said he would cleanse it. He did not like how it looked at him with its carved eyes. The spear Tormund put to his throat was quick and would have been quicker. Jon put his hand on the ash spearhead and leaned. "Put the torch down," he said. "There is no cleansing of the gods this winter, only of wounds." The man sneered. "You think you can hold me by the throat? I think I can hold you by the law," Jon said. "Stannis made it and signed it. Break it and he becomes a liar. He does not like that. He will send me a letter with words like dereliction and sanction, and then he will send men. They will not be happy about the journey. Put the torch down before I must read a letter with words I do not enjoy." The man put the torch down. He was disciplined later by his own captain and did not like that better. One had not died in a yard with a blue star on his shoulder. No southern night had goaded him into a fury he could not contain. He had come back from Hardhome with 3 little children in one hand and 2 in the other, and a long gouge crosswise along his chest where an ice claw had tried to drag his heart out through his skin. He learned to lift beams with breath like a storm and set them into place with fingers that could have crushed a man and did not. The children called him One and then Wind, and then a thing in their own babble that meant the big warmth. He learned to sit outside the smithy where men were working black glass into iron sockets and watch and smile when they smiled. A Manderley boy brought him a pie and ran away when one thanked him, because courtesy from a mountain is a terrifying thing. Val rode the gift as if she had been born in every village in it. Men who would spit at a steward listened when she told them how to stack wood so it would not rot under a wet spring, and where to stand when the cold came to the door at night, and whether goats liked certain weeds more than others. She did not sit in judgment over men unless it was necessary, and then she did, and she did not move when a man tried to shout her into stepping back. She said softly to Jon one night on the wall, "You cannot make a man put down his pride. You can make it heavy. If he wants to pick up something else, he will put pride down for it. If he does not, you give him a heavier thing to hold." "What's heavier?" Jon asked. "Shame," she said. "Hunger, a babe. You sometimes." She glanced sideways. "A god. For men who want to hold a god." He thought of Melisandre and of the hard tree and of the empty throne in the snow at Winterfell that was not a throne and said, "They will try to hold me. I will break." "You won't," she said, and sounded like someone who had decided to rescue a fool and was at peace with her decision. Spring as men liked the word never came. The ground softened and then froze again, as if the season were playing a game with itself. The others tested the edges, always. They looked for weakness not in the wall of ice but in the wall of men. They found less each week. The living moved like men who had memorized a dance. They killed as if they were sweeping a floor they despised. They lit the new glass-cord torches along the ring and watched light travel farther than it had any right to. Jon slept 3 hours a night and pretended he was well. Ghost hunted in circles and brought him hares unasked and lay his head on Jon's knee with the weight of an oath. News came with ravens like Snow's gossip. Cersei Lannister had paraded through a city that still did not like her, with no clothes and less pity. A girl with dark hair and blue eyes had been wed in Winterfell to the wrong man and then had not. She had vanished into snow, because snow will take a woman and hide her better than any cloak. A dragon, a real one, had flown over a brown city and set it on fire because a woman had asked it to, and then had not obeyed her afterward. Men in the south wrote this last with smoke-stained hands, and the words trembled and the ink blotched. Jon folded those letters and put them with Sam's, because change was change and it would come north slow as a sledge, and the wall would still be hungry when it got there. Donel Celtigar came and went and came again, his dragon prow varnished and repainted, his men leaner and richer by turns, his hold filled with black glass and the gossip of 3 coasts. He set a chest on Jon's table once and opened it to show knives wrapped in old velvet and a short sword with a grip bound in red leather. "Valyrian steel," he said, and his voice had the same tone men use over a fire when they tell a story they want to believe. "From a lesser house in the disputed lands. The blade sings. It will cut a man in half before he knows he is 2 pieces." Jon looked at the sword and at the man. "How many obsidian arrowheads buys a song, Lord Celtigar?" "Too many," Celtigar said, and shut the chest. "You will need songs one day anyway." "We will need rope," Jon said. "Bring rope next time." Celtigar laughed. "You are the dullest king I have ever failed to serve." He saluted and went back to his ship and brought rope anyway. On a night that ended without beginning, when the wind had turned its rough side inward, a voice called out on the yard that was not a watchman's or a child's or a man's. It was a song, high and old and made of Snow's bones. The men on the wall stiffened. Ghost's hackles lifted as if a hand had moved along them. Jon stepped out from the shadow of the inner stairs and listened. The song came from beyond the torches, beyond the trees, beyond the way a man's ear could sort distance. It might have come from the night itself, singing to itself to remember what it once had been before fires and wolves and men. Melisandre stood beside him without sound. He did not turn. She did not speak. They listened. The song went on a long time. At last it faltered, as if some throat had gone raw, and ceased. The night bent back toward them. Melisandre's breath steamed. "It learns," she said. "I do not like that." "You thought it could not?" He kept his voice low because anything else was impertinent, either to her or to the darkness. "I thought it did not have to," she said. "When a thing thinks itself supreme, it forgets to learn. This does not forget." "Then neither will we," Jon said. "We are slower," she said. "We must therefore remember better." "What do you remember?" he asked, and only after did he realize he had asked the woman who lived in fire what she was keeping. It did not matter. He had learned to speak to her as a man might speak to a cliff, respectfully and without expectation of reply. She surprised him. "That once I had a different name," she said. "And that once I was small and cold." She paused. "And that once a man refused a crown and made the world narrower and safer because of it." He did not answer. It was the kind of gift a man does not pick up in front of the giver. The next day, Jon heard a child laughing in the yard. It was the same laugh as the day before. He took that for a good omen, not because he believed in omens, but because men need to teach themselves which noises mean hope and which mean danger. He walked the ring and put a hand on a torch and burned the edge of his glove and did not mind the stink of leather. He watched one hoist a beam like a stick and set it in a notch. He watched Val argue with a mason about the way water runs down a wall. He watched Dolorous Ed teach a boy the difference between a line and a cue and then give up and call both cues because it would make the boy happy. A raven came from Bear Island on a night when the moon wore a thin scarf. Lionel Mormont wrote that a ship with a black sail had been seen off the northwestern coast, far out, where even krakens leave men alone. It had a prow shaped like a kraken's head eating a maiden whole. I suppose, the girl wrote in a hand that stabbed the parchment. They mean to frighten us. They do not. We have bears. Jon smiled and made a note to send her rope for nets. If Ironborn troubles came again, they would be down the long rivers. The island would be their last foolishness. From the south, another raven, lordlier, with careful knots in the leather thong that secured the message, Wyman's scribe's work. The Iron Throne had a new hand again. The gold cloaks fought the rose in the streets. Someone had tried to set a great green fire and had succeeded in setting themselves alight. Wyman's note under the news was merry and measured in the same inch. They will begin to ask again in all the lands south what they owe the north. It is a good question. We will answer it when we have time. Tell me when I may send you a singer. The men need a song that is not about a girl's hair and a knight's pride. Send me one who knows how to write. Jon sent back. All our songs should be written down now. There are boys who will need to read them to remember how we did this. Done, Wyman wrote, and 2 weeks later a woman with a harp and a satchel full of blank vellum and a penknife arrived at Eastwatch and sat by the fire and wrote in a hand more beautiful than most men's faces. Rickon Stark came to the wall once before the thaw thinned to threads. Davos had brought him back from the place of goats and stones, and Wyman had fed him until his cheeks had the health a lord should carry in his very skin. He came with Osha, whose eyes had not softened at all, and with a dire wolf who looked at Ghost and did not bow or bristle but simply stood, as a king might stand in the presence of another who has made his own kingdom. Rickon ran up the inner steps 2 at a time and then remembered himself and slowed on the last, because the boy had been taught to be a lord and stubbornly tried to do it. He stood at the top and looked out. He did not speak. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth, and in that moment Jon felt very old, and then very young, and then something that had nothing to do with age at all and everything to do with home. You built this, Rickon said at last, as if the wall had not been there long before Jon's great-grandfather's grandfather swallowed his first milk. He meant the ring fires. He meant the lines of timber. He meant the men who did not flinch. We built it, Jon said. Men who would have killed each other for a sack of oats last winter built it. That is a better song than most. Rickon nodded. He reached down and scratched Shaggy Dog under the jaw. Shaggy made a sound like a mountain thinking. Ghost stood up and stepped forward and touched his nose to Shaggy's, delicate, polite, and then returned to Jon's knee. Osha did not say much. She stood with her back to the wind and watched. After a time she spoke to Val in a voice low enough that men might miss it if they thought these women would speak of small things when they were together. They did not. They spoke of meat and maps and of men with blue eyes who climb differently than living men do. Later Vallok. Ed at something Osha said, a sharp, delighted laugh that startled a boy on the wall into dropping his glove. There were still new sounds in the world. In the deep of night, when the torches hummed and the fire pits belched low and steady heat, and the snow fell with the shy patter of a child's feet running on a long hall's rushes, Jon woke to the certainty that someone was in his room. Ghost's head came up. A figure stood by the window. It took a moment for his eyes to make of it a person he knew. Melisandre's hair was down. It spooled over her shoulder and lay in her lap like a living thing. She did not move. He sat up, the blanket falling from his chest, the cold grabbing at him as if jealous of any heat that belonged to skin. He did not reach for a sword because he had learned, finally, that a sword is not the only answer a man owns. What do you see? He asked. Not in flames, she said. In the dark. I looked into the dark. I thought it would show me nothing. I thought it would be like a wall. It is not. What does it show? Men, she said. It shows men standing. It shows men lying down. It shows a door. It shows a road. It shows a woman with hair like snow walking without shoes along a black beach. It shows a ship with a dragon at its prow and a girl who could be a queen if queens were swords. It shows a room where a boy writes a song about rope. Jon blinked at that last, then let it go. Does it show how it ends? No, she said, and for a heartbeat she sounded like the small, cold thing she had confessed. No, it does not show ends. It shows middles. I do not think anything ends. I think it only becomes something else. Even the night? He should have known better than to ask for comfort there, but men are fools sometimes, and he was sometimes a man. Especially the night, she said, and he could not tell if that was kindness or a warning. He slept after she left and dreamt of wolves running in a forest that had never learned what axes were for. In the morning, he sent men to the crooked stream that had begun to speak again and set a trap for fish with stones, because fish is meat that does not need firewood. He sent another letter to Celtigar asking for rope and pig's fat and iron nails and offering him a song written by the woman with the harp as payment, because men live on pride as much as coin, and a song that says your name and does not laugh is a kind of money. By the time the first flowers poked their faces out of the thaw and then hurried back under because they had misjudged the day, the wall had learned a new way of being the wall. It was no longer a shoulder men leaned against while they waited to die. It was a machine. It burned pitch that smelled of pine sap and distant summers. It swung gates up and down in drills that bored even the men who liked drills. It took children into its shadow and gave them back to mothers who had not expected to see them again, and made those mothers bake bread and mend socks for men they would never have let cross their thresholds a year ago. It was ugly and it was good. One afternoon that was almost warm, Jon stood with Davos, who had returned for a breathing spell with fish stories that were not lies, and watched one carry a length of timber while 4 men fussed around his knees like angry chickens. Davos chewed something and spit it out neatly and said, "Tell me true, Lord Snow, if the thing in the dark comes with summer behind it instead of winter, what will we do then?" "We will learn to fight in shade," Jon said. "We will put glass at the heart of our torches and make new fire. We will call for songs. We will fall down and then stand up. We will do the thing we did this time. We will live until we cannot." Davos grinned with half his mouth. "You talk like a king without a throne." "I talk like a man with too many ledgers," Jon said. "When this is done, I am going to burn the ledgers and then I am going to sleep for a month. You'll get up the first day because someone will tell you the rope is fraying on the south winch," Davos said. "And you'll fix it, and then you'll grumble, and I'll bring you a fish that looks like a lord you don't like." They laughed, felt strange, and then did not. Spring did not so much arrive as run out of excuses. The snow slunk back to the shadows like a thief who had stayed too long. The rivers unlocked their jaws. The dead came fewer and farther between, and when they came, men were ready and sent them back to whatever counted them. The air smelled of last year's leaves for a week and then of wet earth for 2. The day a boy brought Jon a handful of something green and grinned until Jon could count his teeth. He bit the leaf and made a face and swallowed anyway because a man ought to eat the first thing green that trusts him enough to be eaten. Tasted bitter and new and hurt his tongue in a friendly way. He did not think it was over. He did not think anything was over. He walked the wall at dusk and looked north and saw the wide, white spaces where a summer would come and open the world like a hand. Somewhere beyond the bend of the land, a woman with a dragon might be learning to be a queen. Somewhere a boy with ink on his fingers might be writing a song that would teach his grandson how to lay rope so it would not fray. Somewhere a king with a jaw like a vice might be counting spears and deciding how many to break on a stone before the stone understood it was part of a road. Behind Jon, in the yard, a little girl from Hardhome threw a stick and Ghost brought it back and dropped it at her feet and looked up at her with the patient courtesy of a lord permitting a vassal a favor. She threw it again. He brought it again. The sky reached a pale hand down and smoothed the hair on her head. She laughed. It sounded like a bell tied to a sheep in a green field so men could find it when the fog came. Jon closed his eyes and opened them and kept breathing. He felt the weight on his shoulders and the absence of a crown and the quiet of a vow that had not frozen through him yet. He looked north. He did not ask the dark to tell him its plans. He kept his own. He thought of a ship's dragon prow turning into the river's mouth and a chest of black glass and a rope cut at the right moment and a boy's hand that held when it hurt. He thought of a woman with hair like light pushing the last child into the last boat and laughing as the knife fell from her mouth and the boat dipped. He thought of the way the cold had learned to sing and of his own voice saying hold. He said it now, softly, to the wind that carried words away and sometimes brought them back with teeth marks. Hold. It went out into the white. It might come back one day with another answer. It might not. Either way, the wall would be there, humming through its glass hearts, burning, waiting. A hinge kept oiled by stubborn men and women and wolves. The day after, Donal Celtigar's dragon nosed the river again, this time proud and shining with fresh paint. And on her deck a girl with a harp waved to the watchman and asked if there were any words they wanted turned into a tune that would last longer than the men who sang it. Jon told her, rope, and then, after a thought, and bread. She laughed and promised him the finest bread song ever written by a woman who had never baked a loaf in her life. He said that would do. She wrote the words on a scrap while her breath steamed. The letters were beautiful. The wind tried to take them and failed. The others on the wall smiled silently as they read over her shoulder. The night, out beyond the ring of light, considered its next lesson. The day, in close, chose to be longer by a handful of heartbeats. A boy on the Sally stairs dropped his glove again, and this time, when he stooped to pick it up, he did not fumble. He had done it often enough that his hand knew what to do even with cold in it. Jon watched him and nodded as if a gate had swung clean and whispered in his throat, "Where vows live, good." He did not mean the boy alone. He meant the rope, the bread, the men, the wolves, the law, the stubbornness, the ship's dragon and the crab's red hand and the giant who set timbers like knitting needles and the women who stood their ground without steel. He meant all of it, held together by spit and songs and ledger lines and a cold that had taught them how hard it is to stay alive and how possible. And then, because there was always another watch to set, he turned and went to do it.